Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and very, very pleased to welcome you to this event. Today is obviously a very somber anniversary event, the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which was, as all of you know, the largest industrial accident in human history. And we have, unfortunately, we have an excellent panel, but it's not going to be quite as extensive as we had hoped. The student, Hannah Bobick, unfortunately could not attend today because of a class conflict, conflict in class, not because of a class conflict. She's not out there making revolution, but because of a conflict due to a class. So there will be two of us, speaking today, and I'll introduce Kevin in just a moment. But as I said, today marks the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl event. And for my wife, Judy, and I, Judy is sitting in the back, this is also a very personal involvement. I served as the United States ambassador to Belarus from 1994 to 1997, and I'll be speaking in just a moment about my reflections and what we saw and experienced in Belarus in relation to the Chernobyl event. But our other speaker today, to my left, is Kevin Kamps. And Kevin is the radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, which is a very well-known and very responsible and very important organization in Tacoma Park, Washington. He has been following closely the tragic events, in Japan at Fukushima Daiichi, and his expert views have been featured on CNBC and CNN. And in his remarks, Kevin will be offering perspectives on 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And in the order of speaking, I will go first and he will go second. I do want very much at this juncture to thank two others who are in the audience and sitting down right in front of me here, Dennis Rydelsky and Betsy Eastridge, for their efforts in bringing this very remarkable photographic display, which is, one floor up in the Russo Gallery. And this is the work of the award-winning social documentary photographer Gabriela Bulisova. And Gabby, as she is known, traveled and worked in the radioactively contaminated zones of the Chernobyl region in Ukraine and Belarus over the course of several years. And 25 of her images, of her photographs, are on exhibit upstairs for this, the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. And I think you saw probably on the way down, there's the makings of a reception there, and please, after this event is over, you're all invited very cordially to go up and attend that reception. So now, and I would just simply mention that today's event is co-sponsored by the Dickey Center of International Understanding and also the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, and we're very happy to have cooperated on that. I'm now going to move over and sit down and become a panelist. And Kevin and I decided that we preferred to sit and talk. Now, can everybody hear all right? Good. Okay. As I said before, I served as the United States ambassador to Belarus from 1994 to 1997. And by that time, almost 10 years had passed since the accident itself. But Chernobyl was a very critical issue for the government of Belarus. And I've always found it fascinating about how little is known about the one aspect of that accident, and that is that the prevailing winds at the time of the disaster carried much of the radioactive debris into Belarus, and primarily in the southeastern portions of Belarus. And approximately 25% of the agricultural land of Belarus was contaminated and closed off. And most of the local residents in the area either fled or were evacuated under Soviet government orders. And when Judy and I arrived in the fall of 1994, we were warned not to eat domestic berries, mushrooms, or dairy products out of concern for contamination. And I had the opportunity to visit the closed area. It was a very interesting project that was going on. When the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the efforts of the U.S. government was to try to help the governments get rid of excess munitions and weapons, left over from the Cold War. And there was a plant in the contaminated zone that specialized in breaking apart old artillery shells and removing some of the materials which were then being used for pesticides and agricultural purposes. And I was flown down one day, to the region, to Gomel, I think was the city, and from there we drove into the, the contaminated area. And I don't know how many of you have ever had the opportunity, to visit either Chernobyl or the area that I saw, but it was one of the eeriest experiences that I ever had. It was fenced, and there were guards, at the fence, and we drove in, and it was like, probably being on the moon, I would suppose, but it was, there were, trees and grass, but no people, all the houses were empty. It was one of the eeriest, sensations that I've ever had, driving for miles and miles and miles and, seeing no living thing. Until we came to this plant, and the plant, they allowed the workers to come in and work for a few hours a day because they felt that the exposures, were not critical at that level. And, all the work was done inside in sort of closed, contained units. And as I said, it was a very, very eerie experience, to see firsthand, what had happened and sort of how a very large area of Belarus, in effect, had been sterilized. We also heard many stories and talked to many people while we were there who discussed and described the various social, psychological, and economic effects for them, those who were forced to leave their land and to relocate to very sterile urban housing blocks. And for those of you who visited the former Soviet Union, I think you know what I'm talking about. The housing blocks are about as nondescript and ugly as one can possibly imagine, and these were thrown up quickly, to be able to house, some of these people. And I was very struck in the years that we were there by the repeated reports that we were receiving from people former residents who were trying to sneak back into their former homes because of their being displaced and so unhappy. And also reports of people coming from other countries of the former Soviet Union who had been displaced for one reason or another. And then even refugees from Asian countries trying to get into this restricted zone as a place of refuge from whatever it was that they were trying to escape from. And we estimated that approximately 20% of the budget of the government of Belarus was devoted to health care, pensions, relocation, and subsidies, for those exposed to the radiation. There was obviously a great deal of money expended on research on the long-term effects of radiation exposure, and particularly on children for thyroid cancer. But from what I've been able to discern at that time and even in my reading today is that there's still many unanswered questions, about these long-term medical impacts. There are lots of things that you can read, but in terms of getting at the actual facts of what the actual long-term health implications are, there's still many questions. And not surprisingly, fear of the unknown, often buttressed by a very obvious and very consistent lack of transparency and objective information from Belarusian government officials, significantly added to the difficulty of the affected population in dealing with this tragedy. When we arrived in 1994, U.S. government assistance efforts, humanitarian efforts, were already well entrained, but there were complications. And here I'm speaking, as a former ambassador who tried to arrange, for the delivery of this assistance. And when the accident happened, keep in mind that Belarus was then still part of the Soviet Union. And I think all of you know in 1986 when this happened, the way in which it was handled by the Soviet government was the opposite of transparency and openness and free dissemination of information. It was just the opposite, and with very, very tragic results. And this was brought home to me. I was talking with Kevin before we began. And this was very much brought home to me. One of my drivers at the embassy, Belarusian, had been enlisted, and he described for me in significant detail what had happened after the explosion. He was enlisted immediately afterward with a number of friends of his to go down to Chernobyl. Wasn't really told what had happened. They were given very, very little, if any, sort of pre-brief information on what they were going to encounter, what the risks were, given very little in the way of protective either clothing or information. And, he said, though, I asked him, I said, well, now that, you were exposed to all this, is your government, looking after you? And he said, well, I get a medical examination once a year, but it's pretty superficial. And he said that, many of his friends that had gone with him were all suffering, from various diseases. He was a non-complainer, but he did pass away, I think about 7 or 8 years ago. I'm not sure from what, but, I draw the conclusion that it was probably related to that. The healthcare and emergency assistance structures of the Belarusian government dealing with Chernobyl during my tenure, I would have to say were very reminiscent of their Soviet counterparts. Judy and I, we served in Moscow from 1975 to 7, and then again from 1991 to 1993. So we had a pretty fair dose of what it was like dealing, with the Soviet bureaucracy. And I would have to say that the Ministry of Health, in Belarus, and the special coordinator for emergency situations, who were principally responsible for dealing with the consequences and the coordination of foreign assistance, in many ways their methods of operation were very Soviet and not very easy to deal with. Now you may ask what the United States did, in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster in Belarus, and I'm talking just about Belarus right now. And according to the Department of State, the department's humanitarian aid programs have delivered and distributed close to $250 million in humanitarian commodities to the most needy populations of Belarus. And these commodities included medicines, medical supplies and equipment, food and clothing, and the lion's share of this assistance, went to victims of Chernobyl. Now, I would also point out that these figures do not include donations by private individuals and assistance provided by United States non-governmental organizations. and the research assistance that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And when we were in Belarus, this was at the end of the Cold War, and many of our bases in Europe were being downsized. And I actually supervised two of these were actual Army field hospitals from Germany, were actually packed up and delivered and put in place in Belarus. And on both of those occasions, the intent was that these were to be used primarily for for victims of Chernobyl. And I also worked very closely with NIH, because NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they were conducting several studies on the health impacts of the radiation exposure, particularly on children. And quite frankly, it was recognized, by NIH that this type of tragedy could conceivably occur elsewhere, and it was imperative, therefore, to study the effects of radiation exposure on the population, and where else to do it, but in Belarus and Ukraine. Now, as I said, the arranging aid deliveries through the Belarusian government was frequently very time-consuming, frustrating, and consumed with petty bureaucracy. I was dismayed on a couple of occasions when customs officials tried to collect customs and duties on aid shipments, and they were only deterred when I threatened to go public, and explain why some of these shipments of medicines and hospital equipment, were not going to be coming to Belarus, and that usually worked. One effort to donate 2 ambulances was almost cut short by difficulties consistently raised by a number of mid-level bureaucrats. I would note, though, just for purposes of full disclosure, that we were dealing with a very difficult political relationship between the United States and Belarus in those years and in the years following. I think you're probably aware that the president of Belarus is regarded as the last dictator in Europe. He's been president now for 17 years, Alexander Lukashenko. And we had very significant bilateral political problems, at that point. So it was not an easy political relationship to work with to start with. And delivering, the assistance, as I said, was not made any easier by this backdrop of very difficult problems. And we were very critical of Belarus for violation of civil rights, for Lukashenko's efforts to basically make powerless the opposition, to neuter the parliament, to destroy the independent judiciary. And as you probably know, he has been in office now for 17 years, was reelected in December in another fixed and fraudulent election. And unfortunately, his presidency goes on. As for the success of the Belarusian government's plans and programs, this really is still a matter, a lot depends on, where you stand is where you sit. If you're on the Belarusian government side, it's all been very successful. I think those of us who are outsiders are much more critical. My own conclusions, are based on my own observations and discussions that I've had over the years, not only the years that we were there, but since then, with non-Belarusian healthcare professionals who came to Belarus either to conduct research or as caregivers. Credit has to be given, to the relatively large amounts of the national budget of Belarus that were devoted to Chernobyl. But that said, there was much less confidence that the programs were always based on careful and objective study of their effectiveness, and it seemed rather that they depended more on political connections with the Ministry of Health. Small payments have been continued to many exposed to the radiation, but there really have been questions raised by many as to whether these are really helping or whether there might be more effective alternatives, such as creating new non-agricultural based industries in some of the less contaminated areas so that these people could again regain a livelihood. And all too often, frankly speaking, I heard that foreign assistance was viewed primarily as cash cows, and that programs were sometimes begun, in Belarus simply because money was available for them and not because of demonstrated need. And to a very fearful and poorly informed population, it has become the norm to base physical complaints, even such as colds, on the Chernobyl accident when there may not be any reason to do so. No matter which way you cut it, though, this is a devilishly difficult and complicated situation, for any government to deal with. But I would have to say, in conclusion, looking at the Belarusian efforts, that I'm not sure that they have been as well thought out, as well programmed, and as well directed as they should have been. They've been very much consumed by bureaucracy and a lot of interference, which I think is very, very unfortunate. To bring this up to date, I just want to point out also just a couple of things. The 25th anniversary of Chernobyl was marked today in Kiev, and there are two events that were going on, both major international events. There was a pledging a conference that went on aimed at raising more than $1 billion for a new sort of movable containment cover for the the Chernobyl, the area that was that blew up. And the pledging amounted to about $800 million, which is, of course, about $300 million short of the goal. So that was not, fully realized. But again, to give you an indication of the unfortunate politics, that still surround this tragedy, the presidents of Russia and Ukraine presided over a second summit meeting on nuclear safety issues. And the issue was whether or not to invite President Lukashenko. And he was, as far as I know, did not attend. And of course, the issue there is his very fraudulent, unfair, re-election in December. A number of presidential candidates who opposed him and led a demonstration right after the fraudulent election were jailed. They were beaten up very badly, as were thousands of protesters. And the decision was made, not to invite him, to this. And it just, again, is a reminder that in the midst of this horrible tragedy, how politics, have unfortunately, reared their ugly head, and still impinge on the situation. And there was also a study that I think was just released by the United Nations, which pointed out that approximately 7,000 children, have come down with thyroid cancer as a result of Chernobyl. And a lot of that was, because of very poor advice, at the time of the accident. Children were not told to drink, the milk, that was from contaminated areas. They may not have been given the proper pills, etc. So there is a definite, long-term human tragedy, that has come out of this. But the study also pointed out something that I said earlier, that 20 years, more than 20 years have gone by, and it's not always possible to pinpoint, why people have died. People are going to die of cancer anyway, and of other diseases, and it's difficult to pinpoint, sort of what was actually related to Chernobyl. And this is a conclusion that, a lot of people probably don't like, but, as I say, I'm just repeating what was in this UN study. That really points out to me the need for still a lot more research on this very terrible tragedy. So let me stop there and turn the floor over to you, Kevin. Please, go right ahead. Yep, go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Yalowitz. It's a real honor to present here, and also Dennis, for the invitation, and also to express our gratitude for the funding that the Sierra Club provided, which made it possible for the photos by Gabriela Belisheva to come first to Montpelier City Hall and then to move here. And there are future plans in the works for the exhibit to move elsewhere in Vermont and New Hampshire. So my name is Kevin Kamps, and I am the radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear. And I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of our board chairman, Bob Backus, and Carol Backus. Thanks for coming down. And Judith Kaufman is also on our board of directors. And I wanted to convey Gabriela's regret at not being able to come here today. She is teaching at 3 different colleges in social documentary photography and could not get away for either of the exhibits so far. But hopefully at some point she'll get up here to speak as well. So I do have a PowerPoint that's going to assist my tired brain. The title for the show upstairs that you'll see afterwards, if you haven't seen it already, is Life on the Edge, Half-Lives and Half-Truths, related to Chernobyl on the 25th anniversary. And so through incredible irony, we are now experiencing, as a global population, a catastrophe that is brushing up against the magnitude of Chernobyl. And 3 Mile Island was the United States' closest encounter with such an experience. The image on the left is by Bob Del Tredici, who is a Quebecois photographer from Montreal, who's done a number of books on nuclear power and nuclear weapons. He took this photo a year after the 3 Mile Island partial meltdown, it's called. It was a 50% meltdown in 1979. And of course, on the right there is the Chernobyl gaping maw sometime after the initial explosions and fire that burned for 10 days. And this slogan at the top, we held a series of protest actions at the Cook Nuclear Power Plant in southwest Michigan, where I'm from. And a gentleman named Gene Stilp from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who's a longtime TMI watchdog, brought a banner in the year 2000 that said that. And so unfortunately, we now know where next. Fukushima. This is one of the incredible images taken of Unit 3 at Fukushima Daiichi, where the secondary containment building is largely collapsed completely. And I wanted to touch on various areas in pretty rapid order and leave a lot of time for questions and answers and dialogue. Regarding 3 Mile Island, the 30th anniversary was in 2009, and a group called 3 Mile Island Alert in Harrisburg does commemorative events for the 25th in 2004, for the 30th in 2009. And they brought down Arnie Gunderson from Vermont, who many of you are probably familiar with, a nuclear engineer, a former industry whistleblower, to speak about his reevaluation about how much radioactivity was released at 3 Mile Island. And also speaking at that 30th anniversary was Dr. Steve Wing on the right from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who wrote a paper in 1997 in Environmental Health Perspectives, in which he, as an epidemiologist, and this was peer-reviewed, found statistically significant increases in various cancers, such as lung cancer, in the direction of the wind at the time of the accident at 3 Mile Island. And Arnie's reevaluation was that you'd take the official version of 3 Mile Island and multiply by 100. And that's how much radioactivity got out. Because incredibly, when the Kennedy report was done in 1979, shortly after the accident, by about 6 months, it was still believed at that point that there was no meltdown at 3 Mile Island. And it wasn't until 5 or 6 years later, when the reactor lid was lifted and the interior could be examined, that the 50% meltdown was confirmed. And so a reevaluation was long overdue about radioactivity releases. Some other important figures from the 3 Mile Island discussion would be, again, Bob Del Tredici on the left, the photographer whose book from 1980 is called The People of 3 Mile Island, in which he not only photographed, but he also interviewed survivors by the hundreds. And on the right is Eileen Miyoko Smith, who is now the director of Green Action Japan, based in Kyoto, who's played a very important role in the current Fukushima situation. She was ironically on vacation for the first time in a long time in California with her teenage daughter when the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe began. And she's translated immense amounts of material in Japanese into English, not only for an American audience, but also for an international audience. Both of these people went to 3 Mile Island shortly after the meltdown. And Eileen, again, conducted hundreds of interviews. And some of the interviews revealed things like hair loss and severe burns on the skin, which were indications of very much larger radioactivity releases at 3 Mile Island than the official report would admit to. So touching on Chernobyl, this is another photograph taken from a helicopter overflight during the initial days of the fire. And on the right is a map showing Europe and various levels of radioactive contamination. Something that I learned in 2006, which was the 20th anniversary of Chernobyl. There was a big shadow conference held across the street from the official conference conducted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And one of the sponsors of that conference was Nuclear Information and Resource Service in Washington, D.C. And something I learned from Dr. Ian Fairley of the United Kingdom is that 50% of Chernobyl's radioactivity did fall in Ukraine and Belarus and Western Russia. And 70% of that 50% was Belarus, as Ambassador Yalowitz conveyed. But the other 50% of Chernobyl's fallout fell elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, in places like southern Germany and Austria and Wales and Scotland. It fell with the rain. The rain would bring it down from the sky. And there are hot spots in various places around Europe, but we received it here as well. We received fallout from Chernobyl. It took about a week and a half to reach here on the trade winds. I wanted to mention this because it was one of the more cynical statements of recent times in my experience. This is the CEO of Bruce Nuclear Power in Ontario, Canada. And our organization and scores of environmental groups in the US, Canada, and Europe are resisting a proposal by Bruce Nuclear and by Duncan Hawthorne to ship radioactive waste from Canada across the Great Lakes, out the St. Lawrence River, across the Atlantic to Sweden for recycling into consumer products. And what he said during testimony before the Canadian Parliament about a month ago, just before Fukushima began, actually, by days, he said that we are fearmongers and that it's as if Chernobyl just happened yesterday for these people. And of course, 25 years is not very long when you consider the hazardous persistence of some of the poisons that were released by Chernobyl in vast quantities. Radioactive cesium-137 has a 300 to 600 year hazardous persistence. Strontium-90 also 300 to 600 years. Plutonium-239 a 240,000 year hazardous persistence. Again, Chernobyl, and I wanted to mention that there are lots of different handouts from Beyond Nuclear upstairs, also different books about Chernobyl on the table upstairs. And there's one book I wanted to point out to you called Chernobyl, the Forbidden Truth by a Ukrainian journalist named Alla Yaroshinskaya from Zhytomyr, Ukraine. She was elected to the Soviet parliament before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And she gained access to the Politburo's decisions after Chernobyl. And the subtitle of the book was The 40 Secret Protocols of the Politburo. And they were things like mixing radioactive milk and radioactive meat into the Soviet Union's food supply to lower the radiation dose levels, but that meant that millions of people were exposed to so-called low-level doses of radioactivity in the food supply intentionally, so that food would not be wasted. Other Politburo decisions were to require of doctors that they not inform patients that their cancer or other disease might be related to Chernobyl. They were allowed to treat the disease, but not to diagnose it as related to Chernobyl. This from the highest levels of the Kremlin. And the reason I bring all this up is that Dr. John Goffman on the left, who is with the organization in California that watchdogged nuclear power and radioactive health issues for many decades. He was a former director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, an assistant director. He was a a star of the Manhattan Project, if you could say that, a co-discoverer of uranium-233, and a recognized expert on health and radiation. He was also a cardiologist. And he wrote the foreword to that book in the 10th anniversary year of Chernobyl. That was 1996. And in one part, he warned that there would be a battle for the truth at Chernobyl, and there indeed has been. And in another part, he predicted 485,000 fatal cancers resulting from Chernobyl, and an additional number, 485,000 non-fatal cancers. That was his prediction in 1996, 10 years in. And on the right is Dr. Alexei Yablokov, a top advisor to both Presidents Yeltsin and Gorbachev on environmental issues. Beyond Nuclear just hosted him in Washington, D.C. For the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, and he spoke at the National Press Club. He has a book that came out in 2009 that he was the primary author on, along with two colleagues in Belarus, Nestorenko, father and son, actually, where the overall figure for deaths resulting from Chernobyl that he has surmised, and this is a meta-analysis of 5,000 scientific studies in the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian languages that have not appeared in English before. His figure is close to 1 million deaths, and that was up until the year 2004, so that does not include the last 7 years. 985,000 deaths was the figure that he came up with from his study of these various reports. And I also wanted to, when talking about Chernobyl, bring up these two women. Gabriela Belisheva is on the right, the photographer, and that's Wobbly, who she's holding there. Gabby and I met on the Walk Across Europe for a Nuclear-Free World in 1995, and she was not a photographer at the time. She didn't start photography until 1997. But from 2002 to 2006, she went back to the Chernobyl region. We spent about a month in Belarus during the walk. We spent about a month and a half in Ukraine and about a month and a half in Russia on that walk. The walk went from Belgium to Moscow. It was 3,500 miles. It took 9.5 months. And we were a mixture of 25 nationalities altogether. We were about 300 people. And it was, quite an experience. We passed through rural areas of Belarus that hadn't seen Westerners since the German army rolled through in World War II. So it was very emotional for the Germans on the walk, the Belarusians on the walk. But Chernobyl was the heart of the walk all across Europe. This was in the 9th anniversary year, 1995. People across Europe had lived under the Chernobyl clouds, and it affected Europe in a big way. And the woman on the left has also had a lot of experience in Belarus. Her name is Adi Roach. She's the director of the Irish Chernobyl Children's Project. And the ambassador mentioned the private relief efforts to help the people of Belarus after Chernobyl. This grassroots organization in Ireland has brought many thousands, probably, I'm guessing, 20,000 children from Belarus to Ireland over the past 15 years. They started in the 10th anniversary year, 1996, for a month or two of recreation in Ireland in the summer times. And it gets the children out of contaminated areas. They have a lot of fun when they're in Ireland. But in addition to that, there have been many life-saving surgeries. It at first was bringing children in smaller numbers to Ireland for life-saving surgeries. But since then, they've organized teams of doctors to go to Belarus where they can treat much larger numbers of children. And actually, a documentary film from several years ago called Chernobyl Heart documented this Irish group's work, specifically taking heart surgeons from Ireland and the US into Belarus. There's a condition referred to as Chernobyl heart, and it has to do with the radioactive cesium-137 attacking human muscle tissue, especially in children. So very rare, before Chernobyl, unheard of heart conditions in children. And so these medical teams go in, they patch children's hearts that have holes in them. And Adi Roach has led this organization for 15 years now. And she was recently awarded the Nobel Prize in children's work in New York City, near the United Nations. And Gabriella's photographs, a lot of them were taken during a 2003 medical aid convoy, which involved 40 vehicles from Ireland traveling to Belarus across Europe. 35 of those were ambulances, which were then left behind, and 5 were semi-trucks. And they were all packed to the gills with medical equipment and medicine. So there is a raging debate about how many people have died because of Chernobyl. Up until 2006, the United Nations agencies in charge of such matters, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization, held fast to the number 40 or the number 80. These were the firefighters and the plant personnel who were exposed to fatal doses of radiation in the first days and weeks, fighting the fire, trying to put it out, and then dying some weeks or months later from their massive exposures. But by 2006, IAEA and WHO had increased the number to 4,000. And actually, if you studied the fine print in the documents, in the footnotes, the WHO had actually referred to much higher numbers, 9,000, 25,000. But the number that appeared in the official report that most reporters looked at, the executive summary, it said 4,000. But also in that same year, Dr. Ian Fairley, who I mentioned earlier, in the United Kingdom, published a report called the Other Chernobyl Report, or TORCH for short, and presented it in Kiev at the Shadow Conference that I mentioned. And it was sponsored by Greenpeace. And up until that point, their figure was 93,000 deaths. But the Ukrainian government, 10 years earlier, had put the figure at 125,000 deaths and were then criticized by the nuclear industry and other nuclear establishment types for trying to play up the consequences of Chernobyl in order to get more international aid. But as I mentioned, Dr. Goffman, on the 10th anniversary, put the figure much higher. And then Yablokov, more recently, has put it much higher than that. And I just wanted to mention this most recent report that I've just saw with my own eyes for the first time last night. It came through on email. It's the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in Germany. Their German chapter has just put out this report, Health Effects of Chernobyl, for the 25th anniversary. And actually, my coworkers, Paul and Linda Gunter, are in Germany right now and attended the IPPNW conference on Chernobyl. There's a second major Chernobyl conference in Germany put on by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is affiliated with the German Green Party. And an incredible political firestorm is happening in Germany over the Fukushima disaster. The Conservative Party, which has been closely allied with the German nuclear power industry, has done a complete 180-degree switch in recent weeks and is now returning to the German agreement hammered out in 2000 by the Social Democrats and the Green Party when they were in the majority to phase out nuclear power in Germany by 2022. So moving on to Fukushima, the image is of Unit 1 exploding on March 12th, just a day into the nuclear catastrophe. A day after the earthquake first knocked out the primary electricity grid and the tsunami took out the emergency diesel generators at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. As Alexei Yablokov, the Russian biologist, put it at the National Press Club a few weeks ago, Fukushima Daiichi is an unprecedented nuclear disaster in numerous ways, from 3 simultaneous meltdowns in reactor cores, 2 of which have damage in their primary containment structures, which means escape pathways for the radioactivity into the environment. And that's because the secondary containment buildings were destroyed largely by these explosions of hydrogen gas. Another unprecedented part of Fukushima Daiichi is a pool fire, a high-level radioactive waste storage pool fire at Unit 4, when the pool boiled dry and the waste caught on fire about 3 or 4 days into this catastrophe. Another unprecedented part of this is the high population density of northeastern Japan. Tokyo is only about 150 miles away from Fukushima Daiichi to the southwest. Tokyo is 30 million plus people. Chernobyl was a relatively rural area, although the city of Gomel was mentioned, 700,000 people now, not that far away from Chernobyl in Belarus. Kiev is only 80 miles away in Ukraine. And actually, the Dnieper River that flows through Kiev is a primary drinking water source for tens of millions of people. And the reservoir that feeds into it is right abutting up next to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But despite all that, Fukushima Daiichi is a high population density area. And we have, since March 11th, really, once the diesel generators were destroyed and once the battery power ran out, we've been having very significant levels of large-scale radioactivity release to the air and to the water at Fukushima. So here's a map. It shows where the earthquake of March 11th was epicentered, and you can see that Fukushima is very close by. And Fukushima Daiichi is a 6-unit reactor complex, but just 7 miles to the south is the Fukushima Daini nuclear power plant with 4 reactors, both owned and operated by Tokyo Electric Power Company. Other reactors were also implicated in the tsunami. The Tokai Unit 2 is only 70 miles from Tokyo. And also the Anagawa nuclear power plant with 3 reactors is in Miyagi Prefecture, which was the hardest hit, actually, by the tsunami. This is an image of the second explosion of hydrogen gas at Unit 3 at Fukushima Daiichi. This is a high-resolution photograph taken by a drone aircraft, and it shows the 4 units of most concern at Fukushima Daiichi. On the far right is Unit 1 that suffered the first explosion. Then you move to the left by 2, that's Unit 3 that suffered the second explosion. Unit number 2, which looks largely intact from the outside, ironically, was the most significant explosion of all in terms of a reactor core. The explosion took place within primary containment, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has affirmed that the primary containment was severely damaged by that explosion. So even though the secondary containment building is largely intact, you can see that white smoke-like material coming out. That was the most significant reactor explosion so far. And Unit 4 on the far left, that was where the pool boiled dry over a few days, and then the radioactive waste caught on fire. What's most significant about that is that this was direct releases of radioactivity into the external environment, because the hydrogen explosion there caused by the pool fire destroyed the secondary containment building. And in a later slide, I'll show you where the pools are at, and you can see it's a direct radioactivity release to the environment. What's ironic is that by March 15th, there was enough radioactivity in the form of iodine-131 being released that this disaster registered a level 7 on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale that the International Atomic Energy Agency is in charge of. But it took the Japanese government until April 12th to admit that. So what the delay was, no one's really sure. And a colleague of mine was in Wisconsin a few days ago, I was up there for a Chernobyl commemoration, asked if 4 units in severe crisis at Fukushima registers a 28 on the INES scale. The top scale number is 7, but as Yablokov mentioned, this is unprecedented in terms of multiple units in crisis. And lest I forget, at Chernobyl, there were also 4 units. Chernobyl Unit 4 was the one that exploded and burned. And certainly heroic actions prevented that disaster from getting worse. For one example, I didn't learn until a few months ago that the turbine hall staff at Chernobyl stood by their posts with flaming chunks of nuclear fuel and graphite falling through the roof of the turbine hall, starting fires all over the place. They had a very large supply of oil in there that they stood by their posts, they drained it away to a location where it wouldn't catch on fire. That fire, if it had caught, could have spread to all 4 units at Chernobyl. And so that's just one instance of a small number of people, there were only a half dozen people there, who stood by their posts, many of whom died from their radiation exposures for having done so. But they prevented Chernobyl from being up to 4 times worse, really. I wanted to move on a bit to the United States. We just filed a petition from Beyond Nuclear to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission called a 2.206. It's an emergency enforcement petition to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it focused on the 21 reactor units in the United States and then the 24 pools in the United States that are exact replicas of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. These are called General Electric boiling water reactors of the Mark I design. And in this neck of the woods, that includes Pilgrim near Boston, and it includes Vermont Yankee, so close to here. This is the diagram I wanted to show you. You can see at the bottom that donut-shaped thing is the torus. It's a water-filled cavity where the pressure and the steam from a nuclear accident is supposed to be shunted to prevent the primary containment above from being destroyed by a pressure buildup. It's called a pressure suppression system. The Atomic Energy Commission, as early as 1972, recognized that this was a very bad design. The containment, the primary containment, was too small, it was too weak, and it would likely fail in an accident. And back in 1972, one of the Atomic Energy Commission's top safety engineers, Dr. Stephen Hanauer, recommended that pressure suppression systems be disallowed in the United States. Unfortunately, they were allowed, and we have 2021 of this exact design in the United States. You can see the pool in the upper right, the irradiated nuclear fuel storage pool for storing high-level radioactive waste. At Unit 4 at Fukushima Daiichi, that boiled dry and caught on fire. And there's big questions about the status of the pools in the other 3 units because they suffered large hydrogen gas detonations with the pool in a secondary containment building that was largely destroyed by those explosions. And here was another major warning, this time from the follow-on agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Harold Denton, a top safety engineer at the NRC, who actually was one of the top people sent into 3 Mile Island in the earliest days of the meltdown there to advise President Carter. And he predicted in 1986, the year of Chernobyl, that the Mark I containment had a 90% probability of failing during a pressure buildup. And we saw at Fukushima Daiichi in the first days efforts to relieve the pressure by releasing radioactive steam into the environment. And that was the first release of radioactivity. I didn't mention, but Unit 2, that worst of the reactors at Fukushima, very likely has had a full meltdown through the bottom, at least through the weak points of the reactor pressure vessel. That would be the insertion points for the control rods. So there's very likely molten nuclear fuel on the bottom of the primary containment at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 2, which IAEA says is severely damaged, the primary containment. And a full-scale meltdown, that's what's at risk right now at Fukushima, is up to 3 full-scale meltdowns going through the bottom of the reactor pressure vessels, through the primary containment, and then into the environment. So these images are those 2 Mark I's nearby on the left, Pilgrim on the right, Vermont Yankee on the Connecticut. And those are, the pretty pictures that the NRC has on their website. Well, Fukushima Daiichi had pretty pictures too on March 10th, I guess you could say. And I actually went to Fukushima Daiichi last August. I was the guest of Green Action Japan, a part of their effort to prevent the loading of plutonium fuel into the Unit 3 reactor. And the way it works is top one is 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately, a couple weeks after my visit, where I met with the mayors in the local towns there at Daiichi and Daini, the federal government allowed Tokyo Electric Power Company to install plutonium fuel up to 6% in the core of Unit 3. So that contributed to the overheating of that reactor pressure vessel, or that core, and it's now contributing to the radiological releases because plutonium is even more hazardous than uranium fuel. So this is a photograph of the tsunami hitting the Fukushima site. And that's what took out the emergency diesel generators, which were unfortunately in basement areas. So they were destroyed. The batteries only had 8 hours of power to run the cooling systems on the cores. And incredibly, the pools do not have backup power. That's true in the United States, and that's a part of our petition to require that the pools have emergency diesel generators and also backup batteries. Because if you lose the grid here in the US, you would lose water circulation in the pools. And it would take a day or 2 before the water would be completely gone. And then you'd have an hour or 2 before the waste is on fire. So Entergy Nuclear of New Orleans owns and operates Vermont Yankee. It also owns and operates Pilgrim. And it also owns and operates the reactor from Michigan, where I'm from, called Palisades in southwest Michigan. And I just wanted to point out some of these major safety repairs that have gone undone now for 6 years at Palisades. We resisted the 20-year license extension at Palisades, and promises were made to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to the state of Michigan, that ended up with a rubber stamp of the 20-year license extension at Palisades. The major safety repairs that have gone undone, and they are just entering their 20-year extension now within recent weeks. But they've had 6 years to live up to that promise. Replacing the lid, the reactor pressure vessel is highly embrittled. The steam generators need their second replacement at Palisades. The emergency cooling water sumps, which are important to providing cooling water to the core in an emergency, are too small and would become clogged. Fire protections are inadequate. And just to show you the disparity of what's going on, the CEO of Entergy made $53 million in just 2 years, and all of these safety repairs are going undone. Another incredible thing to realize is that Entergy has not put a penny into the Vermont Yankee Decommissioning Fund, even though executives are making this kind of money. So I just want to mention the significance of these issues. In 2002, we had the closest thing to a major disaster in the United States since 3 Mile Island, and that was at Davis-Besse Atomic Reactor near Toledo. The photo on the left was actually in the possession of the NRC before this near accident. And that lava flowing off the reactor lid is boric acid crystals and rust. They didn't seem to understand the significance of this. And that image on the right, the graphic representation, shows that the lid had corroded nearly 7 inches through the carbon steel. All that was left was 3/16 of an inch of stainless steel liner. So it nearly breached. It would have been a loss of coolant accident to the core. And then the containment building would be the last line of defense against a catastrophic radioactivity release. And Palisades is running this risk. The image on the left is a event we held at Palisades in the year 2000. It was the Nuclear Free Great Lakes Action Camp, and we pointed out that a major disaster at Palisades would ruin Michigan's milk supply. That's what that street theater is in the foreground. The emergency cooling system at Palisades, because of the brittleness of the reactor pressure vessel and this dynamic called pressurized thermal shock, could rupture the reactor pressure vessel. And then again, if the containment building fails, it would be a catastrophic release of radioactivity. The dairy industry would be ruined. And that's an image on the right from Fukushima, the destruction of milk because of the radioactive iodine and cesium and strontium contamination. This image on the right is called the bathtub curve, and Dave Lochbaum at Union of Concerned Scientists put this together. It shows that when reactors are new, they have accidents because there are bugs that have yet to be worked out and the inexperience of the plant personnel. So 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl were both young reactors, around a year old, when they suffered their accidents. We've had breakdown phase accidents in the United States that were, again, close calls to disasters. Indian Point, New York had a steam generator tube rupture back in 2000. That's why I put that bathtub curve on here. Davis-Besse in 2002. That's a steam generator on the left. It's one of the ones that Bruce Power wants to ship to Sweden for recycling. If you rupture enough tubes in succession, you could have a loss of coolant accident in the core. And this is my coworker Paul Gunter at Beyond Nuclear. The fire protections at Palisades going undone. What's in place of actual protections are Indiana Jones style, what are called operator manual actions, where workers would be sent on suicide missions to deal with a fire in the plant instead of having automatic systems and fire barriers in place, which cost money. And this issue persists despite another near-miss disaster at the Browns Ferry Unit 1, another GE BWR Mark I, down in Alabama in 1975. So you can see how long these safety violations go on for. And Paul wrote this report just a year ago, and it was inspired by, if you can say that, the Vermont Yankee tritium leaks. Vermont Yankee is the featured part of this report about the leakage of radioactivity into the environment from aging atomic reactors. And this got translated into Japanese for my trip over last August, so there was a lot of interest in Japan. The reason they brought me over actually was specifically to address in Japan the history of leaks from pools in the United States. And Paul included in his report one of the 5 leaks from pools we've had. He included the Indian Point nuclear power plant that's had pool leaks. This is the high-level radioactive waste storage pool. So tritium and strontium and other radioactive poisons flowing into the Hudson River and contaminating the fisheries there. And this again is an image from Palisades. The slogan of our action camp was imagining a nuclear-free Great Lakes. And I've included all those images and issues from Palisades because it shows the kind of company that Entergy is. And really their slogan could be buy them cheap and run them into the ground. That's really how they behave. So this is another issue of great concern at Vermont Yankee specifically, which is where these images come from. Vermont Yankee got a 20% power uprate approval by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They're running the plant at 120% of its original design, despite its advanced age and age-related degradation. So on the left you have the cooling tower collapse, and on the right you have the transformer fire, both of which were related to age-related degradation and the power uprate at Vermont Yankee. Radioactive waste is a million-year hazard. Yeah, I've taken a long time. Native Americans are often targeted for radioactive waste dumps. And let's see, just some images that show the relationship between Fukushima and Chernobyl, the refugees, the evacuees. The attempted helicopter interventions didn't work at all at Fukushima. Decommissioning is an issue. No immediate health risk was a phrase used continuously at Fukushima by the government. And the children are most at risk. I guess this will be the thing I stop on. There's a petition that Beyond Nuclear has signed, is trying to circulate in the United States. The Japanese government has announced that 2 rem per year doses to school children in Fukushima is permissible. And this is really incredible. That's the level that German atomic plant workers are allowed to get in a year. And now Japanese school children are going to be allowed to get it at their schoolyards and in their school buildings. So the petition is calling upon the Japanese government to retract this decision and to better protect the health of the children. And sorry for going on so long. There's so many issues to touch on. So thank you for listening.
We have time for a few questions. Yep.
I have a question going back to the Chernobyl issue. It's come to my attention that the contaminated area around the plant has a great deal of forest growth and wild forest slash that the kind that you would be very concerned with if there was a forest fire. Now, as you remember, last summer the Soviet Union had some terrible fires in around the Moscow area and to the west and slightly to the north, where huge areas, because of drought, burned. My understanding is that there's a great deal of radioactive material resides within the forest, and if a fire broke out, it would be vaporized into smoke and carried downwind. I wonder if you could comment on that, because there are remedial measures that could be done.
Well, you're right. I was in the Chernobyl area for the 10th anniversary in 1996, and it was another shadow conference on the official UN conference in Kiev. And a tour went out to the Chernobyl sarcophagus, and I actually missed the bus. I overslept. And there were forest fires that happened, that began that day when the bus got out there. And the folks on the tour, Michael Marriott at NEARS, the executive director, they smelled the smoke, and there was radioactive contamination in that smoke because the soil and the trees are contaminated over vast regions. And you'll see that in some of the photos upstairs. So the forest fires that happened last summer in Russia, again, were of great concern in not only the Chernobyl area, but also in other nuclear areas, Chelyabinsk in central Siberia. So I just was going to mention, I mentioned that commemoration in Wisconsin of Chernobyl, and there was a Ukrainian speaker there who related her experiences as a teenager in 1986. And they were warned, they knew not to play in the leaves, even in Kiev anymore, because there was radioactive contamination of the leaf piles. So it really, it saturates the environment in so many ways. And then something like a forest fire can resuspend it in the air, it can blow. And back on the 20th anniversary in National Geographic magazine, their coverage, they had a map that showed that the dead zone around Chernobyl, which began as an arbitrary 30-kilometer radius, had been extended, especially to the northwest. And that was because the radioactive hotspots are moving. As they monitor different areas, they discover new hotspots. So the wind and the water will move this material around over vast areas.
Sir? Could you comment on dry cask storage a little bit? What its strengths and weaknesses are?
Okay. Yeah, I kind of rushed through the slides on dry cask storage there. We're very concerned about the pool risks, as you could tell. But we're also concerned about the status quo dry casks that are used in this country. There are serious quality assurance violations going on in the design and manufacture of those containers. These are silos of concrete and steel, or sometimes they're all metal, where the wastes from the pools are moved into these dry casks and stored there indefinitely. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has recently permitted storage on site at a place like Vermont Yankee for 120 years, 60 years of operations and 60 years post-operations. And the pool risks are being increased because companies like Entergy are keeping the pools full to capacity, 500 tons or more of waste in the Vermont Yankee pool, compared to Fukushima Unit 4, which had 130 tons of waste. So you can see that the boil-off could happen much more quickly if there's electricity loss from the primary grid, and also the consequences could be 3 to 4 times worse. So dry cask storage, which uses convection air currents to cool the waste inside. There's no moving parts, there's no water. It's a safety improvement, but it's not safe. It's not designed to withstand terrorist attacks. It's still vulnerable to various accident scenarios. And so what we're calling for, I can pull up a slide, is hardened on-site storage. This would be to do dry cask storage right. It would be to require very high-level quality assurance on the design and manufacture, to fortify it against terrorist attacks, and to safeguard it against accidents. And we have 200 environmental groups in the United States calling for it, but it's not what is happening now.
Sir?
I heard it once mentioned that nuclear energy is the most expensive, dangerous, and asinine way to boil water ever invented. However, having said that, let's assume that we decommission these plants. What do we use to replace the loss in energy to make up the difference?
I'm going to jump up here so I can show you a
Please.
slide that I wasn't able to. If I can find it. Right here. Yeah, well, here's the previous question. This is about hardened on-site storage, which we're calling for. And on the left, you see an image of what a fortified dry cask could look like to prevent a terrorist attack with something like a TOW anti-tank missile. Another safety advantage of dry cask storage, and especially hardened on-site storage, is the pool at Vermont Yankee has 500 tons of the material in one place. That's the pool. It could all go up in flames in one fell swoop. So dividing it up into dry casks at 10 tons each is another safety improvement. And this is the current question. Dr. Arjun Makhijani wrote the book on the left, Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy, in 2007. And the thesis of the book is that by 2040, the United States could phase out fossil fuel and nuclear power from its economy, both electricity sector and transport sector and heat sector, you name it, and replace it with energy efficiency maximized and renewable sources of electricity, like solar power, like wind power. And this could be done with no technical breakthroughs required. We have all the technology we need right now. And it would be the same percentage of our gross domestic product as we currently expend on expensive fossil fuel imports and expensive nuclear power. And some recent developments just underline Dr. Makhijani's findings. Several months ago, Duke University put out a study called the Historic Crossover. And what it referred to was new nuclear power and new solar photovoltaic is now cost equivalent. And this is despite 50 years of nuclear power receiving the lion's share of public subsidies in the United States to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, and solar and wind getting the crumbs. So the potential is there, and Germany, I'll just end with this. Germany, its EPA has done a study which has very similar findings to Dr. Makajani. They just did it this year, that renewables and efficiency could replace fossil fuels to the extent that their Kyoto obligations would be met, and that's like a 95% reduction in carbon emissions, and also with the phase out of nuclear power, which is now targeted for around the year 2022 in Germany.
Yes, sir.
How many nuclear plants have been shut down in history? I grew up near Hanford, so probably a lot. And we did town-wide evacuations to the desert. I remember that. And I remember the milk scare and all of that, but nothing much done. Now the Agency for Toxic, whatever that, ATMRD or whatever it is, was a study out about thyroid problems from the iodine plutonium, with a denial that it's had any great effect at all. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, related to Hanford, but any others that have been shut down,
Okay.
like in terms of the total that are still existing?
I can only answer that for the United States. I don't know globally or internationally. But in the United States, there have been about 25 commercial scale atomic reactors permanently shut down. One of them is Big Rock Point in Michigan. I don't know if I can find that slide. It's the one about decommissioning. There it is. So this small 70 megawatt electric reactor in northern Michigan called Big Rock Point was shut down in 1997 after 35 years of operations. It's about a tenth the size of Vermont Yankee, even smaller than that. It made a really big mess. It was an experimental reactor. They broke plutonium fuel rods in the core. They had huge releases of radioactivity. And even though it was so small, they spent $366 million on the cleanup, which sounds like a lot of money, but they left plutonium in the soil. They left plutonium in the groundwater. They never even checked the Lake Michigan sediments in the discharge canal where they discharged radioactivity for 35 years. 6 months after they shut Big Rock Point, the radiation monitors went off at the top of the discharge canal, deep into the facility. And when they investigated, they found that radioactive algae from the lake had washed up the discharge canal and set off the radiation monitors. So what did they do? They dismantled the radiation monitors, and the NRC let them. So they have significant radioactive contamination on this site. They also have 8 silos of high-level radioactive waste in the dry casks that have nowhere to go. And the biggest decommissioning in the country is about to get underway north of Chicago by 30 miles, called Zion, Units 1 and 2, each of those 1,000 megawatts. And incredibly, the company in charge, Energy Solutions, its history is really shady. It was formed on a bribe and extortion scandal in Utah back some 20 years ago. And now it's the biggest nuclear waste company in the country, and it's in charge of this decommissioning. So the thing about these decommissioned plants like Maine Yankee is even though the facilities have been entirely dismantled, what's left is the high-level radioactive waste in the dry cask storage, Connecticut Yankee as well as the lingering radioactive contamination of the site.
How many sites are there now after?
There are, 104 operating reactors in the United States. Those are the commercial. There are additional research reactors.
In the back.
To answer your question about how it can be replaced, if you go on VPERG website, there's a link to a report they put out within the last couple of years that shows what percent would be able to come from wind and solar to be able to replace Vermont Yankee. You should see a link to their report.
The point of my question was Samsø Island in Denmark is totally self-sufficient with the use of solar and wind energy, but that's on a small rural scale. How do we do that with something like the size of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, and so forth and so on?
There's a copy of Dr. Makajani's book upstairs, and there's a graph in there in the illustrations part that shows where the electricity grid would come from, the electricity supply, and it's all renewables and efficiency. The United States has immense resources in renewables. It varies by region, and it's going to require, one nation under God working together with geologic diversity, geographic diversity. The Southwest has tremendous solar potential, so does Florida. The Great Lakes and the Eastern Seaboard have tremendous wind potential, as do the Great Plains. And there are other sectors. There's geothermal, there's certain forms of biomass. So it's doable. That was the finding in various studies. Scientific American did one as well. 100% renewable electricity supply in the United States.
Sir? Sir? Yeah, Ambassador, 2 questions. First, Ambassador, then Mr. Kamps. Ambassador, would you comment on the reports I've heard that Belarus is reoccupying some of the areas that were evacuated after Chernobyl?
Yeah, I think I've seen the same reports, and frankly, it doesn't surprise me. As I think you can tell from my remarks, the way that they have conducted policy there is not always transparent, clear, and given the nature of the presidential leadership there, frankly, nothing would surprise me. I hate to put it that way, but that's about the best answer I could give. Nothing surprises me there.
Now, relative to the petition for the Japanese government about a lot of radiation exposure for school children in the Fukushima area, objecting to 2 rem per year exposure, what level does the petition recommend?
Well, under normal conditions in the United States and Japan, the regulatory limit is 100 millirem per year for members of the public. This is a nuclear catastrophe situation in Japan, and so they are loosening those restrictions. And we think it should not be done on the backs of children. There are other options. It's called the Japan Federation of Environmental Attorneys has suggested to the Japanese federal government in support of the petition that non-contaminated areas be used, that the schools there take in children from Fukushima to avoid this exposure, because children are more vulnerable than adults to radioactivity. But these levels, like 100 millirem per year under normal conditions, that's from what's called the reference man, which is a 25-year-old white male in the United States anyway, but many countries use a similar system. It doesn't account for children's increased vulnerability, other more vulnerable members of the population, especially fetuses, pregnant women, people with immune system problems. So the National Academy of Sciences for decades now has affirmed that any exposure to radioactivity carries a health risk. The greater the exposure, the greater the risk. But even at low doses, there is a risk. There's a health risk. So for children in Fukushima, Japan, to be exposed to as much radioactivity as German atomic plant workers are allowed is just not acceptable. There's other options. And it shouldn't be based on trying to keep these schools open in these contaminated areas.
Yep.
I was impressed by one of the numbers you used of the years after 3 Mile Island was, before they could discover the actual damage that had been done. And Fukushima seems so much more complex, with several reactors damaged and the spent pool fuel fire. It may be a long time before we really get to know what the condition of the containment vessel is and what the resulting risks are.
Very much so. For example, at Unit 4 pool, once the water was gone, water is not only thermal cooling for the hellishly hot waste, it's also radiation shielding for human beings. Once that water was gone, even just a little bit, if this much of the fuel rods were sticking out the top of the pool water, the dose rate in the area, the immediate vicinity of the pool, was now in the tens of thousands of rems per hour, very likely, which means a fatal dose of gamma radiation within seconds or minutes if you're there. And that's why they couldn't simply go up there with a hose and stick it over the side and refill the pool. They had to then try the helicopters, which didn't work, and then the water cannons and the fire trucks and the concrete pumps and all that stuff to get water in the pool, which they're still doing, by the way. So yes, it's going to be very difficult, and has been. Here we are 6 weeks into this nuclear catastrophe at Fukushima, and there are so many basic questions going unanswered. What is the condition of the pools in units 1, 2, 3, and 4? What's the status of the reactor pressure vessels in units 1, 2, and 3? You can go to a site, I didn't put it up, but it's the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. They had been doing daily updates on Fukushima Daiichi, and they say very serious situation. That's their catchword. They have a chart that shows the states of the various reactor units and their pools, and red is the worst indication. So it's just basic information that they don't have. They don't know the status of the reactor pressure vessels. They don't know how much water is still in the cores. Doing any cooling? Is there no cooling whatsoever? So we don't know because of the very high radiation levels. They can't send people in. They're trying to use these remote drones to take pictures from above. They've sent cameras on robots, on cranes above to look down, and they're trying to send more and more robotic machinery in, not only to take pictures and to measure radioactivity levels, but to even move very contaminated concrete debris, for example, out of the way, or to cover it up with earth so that workers can get into places where right now it would be very hazardous for them.
Ken, is it appropriate to perhaps break, let people get some refreshments, and
Yes.
keep the questions going individually?
Yeah, I think that's, is there one last question though? I think it was, yeah, in the back there, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to make a quick comment on the question that was before.
Please.
I'm a Dartmouth student. I'm from Belarus, and I happen to know the situation in my country. And about your question about the people coming back to the contaminated areas, it's actually quite true, because the 30 kilometers area is not imposed anymore, and actually it's there, but no one is prevented from entering. And if people really insist on coming back to their houses, they're allowed to, and there are actually people living there in the so-called dead zone. And and there are actually, there are more gossip right now, of course, because our government would never confirm it, but there's gossip going on in the country that there are even products coming not from the 30 kilometers though, but from the border territories. A lot of contaminated dairy and agricultural products coming from this area. Yeah.
Good, and let me introduce Anya Bobok, who's, raise your hand, Anya, good to see you. She had a conflict with class today, but you'll be here for the reception now. Yeah, so please, join, let's go upstairs, and great, we have, young students from both Belarus and Ukraine. So, and Kevin, thanks very much. Thanks
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.